I'm Safwan Masri, Executive Vice President for Global Centers, and it is really a pleasure for me to welcome all of you and to kickstart the activities of the Sabanci Center for Turkish Studies. The generosity of the Sabanci family, Güler Sabanci in particular, and the work of the Columbia Global Centers in Istanbul, İpek Şemtaha, its leader, Ryan Carmichael from Development, to initiate and to get started for the first time in Columbia's history a Center for Turkish Studies and a chaired professorship in Turkish Studies is something that is incredibly wonderful. This is housed in the Arts and Sciences, and the timing of this launch could not be more opportune as we turn more and more of our attention to the study of Turkey. The discussion today, following last Sunday's constitutional referendum in Turkey, with a very distinguished group of scholars whom I'll introduce in a second, who all have deep expertise on Turkey and the broader region, is also incredibly timely. The referendum, as you know, for a constitutional shift from Turkey's parliamentary system to an executive presidential one, passed with a very, very narrow margin. This, of course, shows that the Justice and Development Party, AKP, has lost significant ground, especially in large cities like Istanbul and Ankara and Izmir. Those cities, of course, historically have voted overwhelmingly for AKP. So the legitimacy, of course, is in question of the elections, but regardless of which way this moves forward, it uncovers a number of very important questions. You know, how will Recep Tayyip Erdogan use his political power that he acquired through the referendum against the other half of the country that voted against the referendum? Will he recognize the concerns of the no voters, or will he continue disregarding his opponents and further polarizing the country along religious and ethnic divisions? So when I say disregard his opponents, I'm being very, very generous and optimistic over here. How will the referendum result affect international relations? You know, shall we expect a process of normalization with European countries, or an intensification of tensions that have prevailed over the past few years? So I do hope that our panelists today will touch on these subjects as they discuss a number of things related to the referendum. I want to thank İpek Şemtaha from the Istanbul Center and Emre Hatipoglu for organizing this panel. I want to recognize also the European Institute for being a partner and being a co-sponsor of today's event. So let me very quickly introduce our panelists. Sinan Ciddi is second to my left, Executive Director of the Institute of Turkish Studies at Georgetown University, where he currently is a visiting assistant professor. Sinan is an expert on Turkish domestic politics and foreign policy, and his recent book, Kemahlioglu in Turkish Politics, The Republican People's Party, Secularism and Nationalism, focuses on the electoral weakness of the Republican People's Party and examines the roles of nationalism and Kemalist ideology in Turkey. Lisel Hintz, to Sinan's left, is a visiting associate professor of political science here at Barnard College. Her research focuses on identity politics and foreign policy in Turkey, politics of the Middle East, the intersection of comparative politics and international relations. She has a book that is forthcoming with Oxford University Press and entitled Identity Politics Inside Out, National Identity, Contestation and Foreign Policy in Turkey. We also have with us Ozge Kemahlioglu, who's an associate professor of political science at Sabancı University. Her book, Agents or Bosses, Patronage and Intra-Party Politics in Argentina and Turkey, provides a comparative analysis of clientelism in public employment, the practice of offering jobs in return for political favors to a party or politician. And then we have my colleague and friend John Huber, who is a professor of political science at Columbia University, who teaches and conducts research on the comparative study of democratic processes, ethnic politics, inequality, and the politics of redistribution. He's the author of Rationalizing Parliament of Deliberate Discussion, Institutional Foundations of Bureaucratic Autonomy, with Charles Schippan, and Rationalizing Parliament, Legislative Institutions, and Party Politics in France. He has a recent book, Exclusion by Elections, Inequality, Ethnic Identity, and Democracy. John helped establish Columbia's undergraduate summer program on democracy and constitutional engineering, which was held very successfully in Tunisia and Turkey through the global centers, and we hope to keep that course going. Before I turn it over to our panel, I just want to remind you that the event is on the record and will be video recorded. So please join me in welcoming this august panel.
I want to give you some background information of, first to start, some background information on the electoral politics in Turkey and the support for referendum in the maybe last 1.5 years among the public, support for the proposal that was voted in the referendum. First, I want to talk a little bit about the electoral politics in Turkey, how we reached this point of the referendum. So here I have the vote shares of the, as a share of the valid votes, the vote shares of the 4 major parties, we can say, starting from 2002 elections, going until 2017. I did not here include the 2 other referenda that took place in 2007 and 2010 because it's hard to compare the vote shares. So these are only including local elections and general elections. So what we can see here is that these 4 main parties remained in place in all these years. AKP's vote shares, you can say that there is a linear increasing trend with ups and downs, and CHP kind of stabilized after the 2011 elections, and MHP, and again with some ups and downs, there is the Nationalist Party, the right-wing Nationalist Party, and HDP representing mostly the Kurdish population with alliances with the left, especially towards the end of this time period in June 2015, November 2015 elections, has been on the rise in the most recent years, after especially the 2014 presidential elections, where the leader of the party, one of the leaders, co-leaders of the party, participated in the presidential elections. So, I just wanted to give you a background on the electoral dynamic, and that the blue spot there is the combined nominee, or the combined candidate of the CHP and MHP in the presidential elections. So you can see that it almost adds up to the vote share of the 2 opposition parties. So this is the electoral dynamics background. If you have any questions on this, we can come back to this in the discussions stage. So this is how the public opinion in favor and against the proposal changed in the last more or less 2 years. So this is, I took it from a public opinion company. They basically do the monthly public opinion surveys, and so this is exactly from their webpage that I took this graph. So mostly interviewing around 1,000 respondents representing the population and asking about different questions about the political dynamics. Of course, before the proposal, the actual proposal was actually quite late in this timeline. So the actual proposal came to the parliament in January 2017, and you can see, but the discussion was ongoing for a long time. So here this gives a track of the support in favor against the presidential system in the beginning until the point where the actual proposal came into the parliament. So you can see that it's from the beginning it was a very close referendum. I mean, it was there was not a very thank you very much, a very clear preference of society for in favor against it. So there were some, of course, critical events that affected the public opinion. So you can see, sorry about the Turkish there. So the first red time is the June 2015 elections. The second red point is the November 2015 elections, and then there is the coup attempt. And as I marked it, that's the actual proposal, where the actual discussion about what the proposal was about started being discussed. So what you can see is that again, from the beginning, there was a clear opposition, around 40% against the presidential system, which increased between the elections, and then after the November elections, you can see some slight decrease, and then the coup attempt was an important point where, again, the opposition against the presidential system started to decrease, but then increased again. But you can see also that the support for it actually increased a lot in the last few months, actually after the actual proposal was starting to be discussed. So this gives you some kind of idea about how the public opinion dynamics changed across the time period. So I don't want to talk, I think Sinan is going to talk more about what happened before. After giving that background information, I wanted to talk a little bit about what this implies for Turkish politics. As the introduction nicely pointed to it, of course, now there is, after the results after the actual referendum taking place, of course, now there is this discussion about the legitimacy of the referendum. And I don't want to go into the details of how it happened, how electoral fraud could have happened, how whether the different arguments, there are many different arguments about how what the mechanism through which its electoral fraud could have happened. But the important thing is that there is a major discussion about electoral fraud happening in the referendum. So I think it is too early to provide any factual information about it. I personally don't have a lot of information about what really happened. But I want to focus on one thing because it has, of course, a clear effect on the perceptions of the population. And the legitimacy of the elections, which is critical for democracy, is already, and the legitimacy of elections was already started to be questioned back even 2015. So it is a real issue for the voters, citizens, because this is a pre-electoral survey from 2015 June elections. And to a question which asks, after the votes are cast in the upcoming election, do you believe that the votes will be counted in a fair manner? So this is exactly about electoral fraud, whether you think that is happening or not. And there is a fairly important amount of the people who believe that there is not a fair counting of the elections. So whether they have any factual information on this, whether they really have any data on this, we don't know. But the important thing is that there is people have doubts about this, and it's going to be important for the legitimacy of the system and also for the polarization. Of course, if you're interested in Turkish politics, you know that there is a very high level of polarization, and this is going to, this is clearly going to increase the polarization among the groups that were in favor and opposing the referendum. Again, I'm giving you some points to maybe discuss later on. That was one important point that I see about the results of the referendum. And in terms of the institutions, what kind of changes it will bring about in terms of the political system. So what are the actual changes that have happened through the referendum? So I want to talk about different points. So what was going to improve according to some maybe normative concepts that we might have about democratic rule, what might deteriorate. So one issue that I want to discuss a bit is the issue about the president being able to call for early elections. So again, if you're interested in Turkish politics, we know that party discipline is quite high as expected in a system where you would have a parliamentary system. And we have party leaders having a quite important role in the candidate nomination process, so that has contributed to the party discipline. And one thing that might be expected to happen is that when the president has the possibility to call for early elections, it might increase the party discipline even further, because defecting party member from the president's own party, if they know that they're going to go for early elections, and if the president or the head of the party is going to play the main role in nominating the candidate for the new elections, who is going to defect from the party? I think that's going to be really critical. So whenever the president, if ever, sees some kind of opposition in the parliament, I think this is a very important tool that the president, newly elected president, can use to maintain discipline among the party members. So this is actually, I think, party discipline is not in theory bad, but what kind of, the key issue is here whether there can be any opposition from the legislature or from the party itself to the policy proposals of the executive is the main issue. And what can be even more problematic, from my point of view, is that there is now a discussion about changing the electoral system. So we have a closed list PR system, and one of the discussions, we don't know whether it's going to come to the table or not, but one of the discussions is changing it to a single member, simple plurality system, which is going to make the party candidates very much focus on the local politics. So when they are going to be the only candidate selected from the district, electoral districts, there, the expectation would be that they're going to focus quite a lot on the local politics. And I think both of these institutional changes might take the legislature's role really away from the national policy making process, because they're going to be involved in the local party, local politics of their own district, and the president is going to have this real power of imposing discipline on the party members. So the legislature, as a check on the policy making process or the policy proposal of the executive, is going to be much more weakened. Another point, again, these are not related points, but I wanted to put them start the discussion with these. Another point is one of the positive aspects of the proposals that the Prime Minister has discussed in various venues is, and he was saying that with these new institutions, there is going to be an improvement in accountability, because now the voters are going to know who are responsible for the policies that are implemented, and they can hold the president accountable through the election. So, and this is something that has been discussed in the political science literature too. So the Prime Minister, when he was talking about the proposal, has been focusing on this in some. And again, this can be. This has been shown to happen, but I really doubt that this can happen in the Turkish party system because of the fragmentation of the opposition. So, with the current party dynamics that I showed you earlier, so the electoral system for the presidential elections is a two-round election. So if one of the candidates in the first round manages to win more than 50% of the vote, then that person is going to be elected president. If no candidate receives it, then they're going to be the first winner, or the two first high vote gatherers in the first round that will go into the second round. So the expectation is that if the voters are not satisfied with the performance of the president, then they're going to vote against the incumbent president. This, given the political dynamics of the system, seems very difficult because of the fragmentation of the opposition, especially the Kurdish nationalists and the Turkish nationalists find it very difficult to coordinate. So it is very unlikely that they would vote for a second round candidate as a response of their dissatisfaction with the incumbent. So for this to happen, they have to be able to switch their vote. So for a large share of the electorate, or let's say the electorate that votes for AKP, but for example, but then in the case of dissatisfaction would for another party, they would find, or for another candidate, would find it very difficult to coordinate on a candidate that is supported by especially the HDP or the Kurdish population. So, and one other issue that seems problematic from what was happening before the referendum is, of course, the delegitimization of the opposition. Unfortunately, a lot of opposition in the campaign period, they were, officials talking about how, the opposition was supporting terrorism. If you're saying no to the referendum, then you're working with the terrorists. All this delegitimization of the opposition is, of course, going to be built into the first discussion of legitimacy and polarization. Again, for example, civil society movement. When there were these doubts that came about with the fairness of the elections or the possibilities of fraud with the counting of the votes after the elections, there was an important civil society movement. There were a couple of different civil society movements that arose that wanted, I mean, their main purpose was to show that, you know, the counting process is done fairly, and there was even an effort to curb those civil society movements. So if the goal is to increase the efficiency, the legitimacy of the system, this kind of delegitimizing the opposition, either in the civil society movements or, you know, anyone who has outspokenly stated their preference for one of the legitimate results of the referendum is going to be problematic, given especially the polarized context of the country. So, you know, isn't there any, I mean, aren't there any positive consequences, possibly positive consequences of these changes? Of course, there has been a very much, I mean, for a long time there was a discussion about the military courts in Turkey. So the removal of the military courts and the removal of the higher military courts representative from the constitutional court was, for example, is seen by a large part of the population as one positive consequence of the changes. But even with that, some people have doubts because the share of the judges in the constitutional court appointed by the president is now even going to increase further, because now the number of judges decreased to 15 as a result of removal of the 2 high military court judges. So the number of judges that are appointed by the president stayed the same. So when you increase the total number, of course the share has increased. So the president is going to now appoint even larger share of the of the constitutional court members. And the final question is, you know, of course, the main point behind the proposal, the main motivation behind the proposal was to say that there is it's going to lead to an efficiency in the system. It's going to be much more efficient government, and maybe we will discuss later, because I'm running out of time, whether this can really happen or not.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for making time, and thank you to Columbia University. And it's an honor and a privilege to be one of the first event participants at the Sakıp Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies at Columbia. So thank you to all our hosts and for taking the time to organize this. It's been a few days, I think, since the most recent tumultuous political event that seems to have taken place in Turkish politics. We seem to have a lot of these in the last few years, and I think people who follow Turkey, be it politicians, scholars, or newspaper or journalists, I should say, in America or Western Europe, it's always what's next. You know, what's the next crisis in Turkey, and why do we have to worry about it? And that's a legitimate question. And I think what this most recent referendum now speaks to, or what is a pointer at, is I think there is something to be said about an increasing state of emergency in Turkey that is coming to a head. So first of all, I should say is, you know, what does this referendum imply? What does it mean in Turkey? The first thing I can point to is essentially say that it prolongs and it precipitates an existing political crisis that is not going to be solved with the outcome of one vote, whether you perceive it to be fair or not. But what I want to do is basically try and take a few minutes to speak to you about how did we get here? I mean, I don't want this to be perceived solely from the perspective of a referendum happened whereby voters were asked to basically reflect on a couple of ideas or things that a president, an existing president, or an existing political establishment sought to achieve. That's one aspect of it. But what is the wider framework? How did we get here? Why is this so significant? And what may be some of the longer term impacts of this? Well, simply, Turkish voters were asked last Sunday to go to the polls, to the polling stations, and essentially cast a vote on a series of constitutional amendments, 18 in total, of the existing 1982 constitution in Turkey, that fundamentally alters the system of government in Turkey, away from now a parliamentary system ruled by a council of ministers to an executive presidency, which is hard to sort of compare because nothing quite like it exists in any other political system as far as we can make out. Some parts of this come into effect and force immediately, but the majority of requirements for what is supposed to take place will require enabling legislation, which will essentially be put forward and passed by Parliament in the next 2 years. So by the time 2019 comes along, the system is supposed to essentially take effect. Okay, so why did Turkey's governing president, Tayyip Erdogan, request this? Or why was he interested in this? Why was this tabled? And why were voters asked to move away from a parliamentary system to a presidential system? I think there's a wider framework in this, and I think I'll come to that in my last minute or two and answer that. But essentially, it's how Tayyip Erdogan, I think, interprets politics and what he has sought to do in politics. For Erdogan, my conception is politics, since he was elected as prime minister all the way back in 2003, has been about existentialism. That's what lies in the heart of my convictions about politics for him. For Erdogan, it's about survival, an existential ability to exist in the field of Turkish politics. And for him and his political movement, which he descends from, that was no small feat. Erdogan comes from one of the oldest political movements in Turkey's political history, which is political Islam, as he is a particular branch that he belongs to. Now, we don't have time to go into this, but suffice it to say, this movement, as it became a mainstream political movement in the 1960s, is anti-systemic. It had a problem with the existing secular nationalist regime, the Kemalist regime, that had governed and established the Republic of Turkey since the 1920s. It had sought to distance Turkey from its Western anchor, its EU aspirations, its NATO alliance, its transatlantic partnership, but also its secular lifestyle, because it was seen to be a tutelary imposition upon Turkey's broader culture and political options. And it's an existential pursuit for Erdogan, simply because pushing against that resulted in the clamping down of the movement, to put it mildly. It resulted in violations of individual rights of more conservative people, but the variability of the political Islamist movement in Turkey that espoused a more, let's say, a political Islamist pursuit in the Turkish conception, which would have to be defined more obviously in time, stood to challenge the certainty of the status quo, the establishment of the secular nationalist establishment. Therefore, all conceptions of political Islamist parties have been shut down one way or another. Erdogan himself has gone to jail, right? His Justice and Development Party in the last few years has come close to being shut down by the secular judicial establishment. Right from the get-go, when his party was elected in 2002 and when he became prime minister in 2003, Erdogan had to make himself and his political movement, in a transformed way albeit, palatable to the status quo and judicial establishment and the secular military establishment of the country. And what you see in that time frame, the early Erdogan that we know, from about 2003 when he became prime minister, up until about 2007, 2008, you see the deliberative, the consultative, the listening, the representative prime minister in building electoral alliances, in pursuing hitherto bedrock policies of the Turkish state, be it in the domestic arena or in the foreign policy arena. In the domestic arena, Erdogan passed more secularizing laws, upholding secular education, strengthening the judicial appointment system at the time, for up until about the late 2000s. In the foreign policy arena, it was ironic that his political movement, which had sought to distance Turkey and pull Turkey out of its EU anchor, is on record for basically beginning accession negotiations, a political feat which no other person has managed in that time. He served as one of the prime ministers at the time which really raised Turkey's international profile. as a mediator between intractable Middle East problems such as Israelis and the Syrians, even going as bold as trying to mediate between Iran and the West, and even between the Israelis and the Palestinians. He also upturned Turkey's bedrock intransigent policy of not changing policies over the island of Cyprus, and almost successfully overturned the biggest millstone around Turkish foreign policy. Given that, and given the fact that he built such a strong electoral profile, which galvanized voters in Turkey for such a long time, that allowed not just people of conservative convictions, but also secular, nationalist, as well as even ethnicists, such as Kurdish identities, to vote for him. How do we get to where we are now, where he is seen as increasingly polarizing figure? This will take an age, but I'm trying to condense this. But if his first term in office between 2002 to 2007 was aimed at making himself and his movement palatable to the secular, nationalist, Kemalist establishment, I think from henceforth, as he has become stronger, as he has convinced more voters, what he has been involved in is making basically the obscene palatable and acceptable. The reason why we have had this referendum on Sunday gone, just passed, is also a reflection of existentialism. The AKP and the Erdogan camp have essentially stated that parliamentary system has become inefficient, that it cannot achieve stability, macroeconomic security, systemic security from terrorism, from outside regional disputes and the possible serious spillover into Turkey. But that's a matter of opinion and debate, as is mine. And those existential considerations that he has now is one that's based on survival from being taken down for a long time now from other forces in society, which has crept up. Those have been, in the late 2000s, the judicial system, as I've already mentioned. The country's constitutional court came one vote short in shutting down his party in 2007-2008. In 2014, late 2014, numerous and very damning corruption allegations were leveled against his party, his family, himself, and various operators within the Turkish state. My job here is not to necessarily state that those were true, but they presented an existential threat to himself, which, if they had their day in court, quite possibly could have taken him down, his family, as well as his party officials throughout the political establishment, ranging from the National Party all the way down to the provincial organization of the party. Not least of all, this was compounded by popular protests and uprisings, which was the crowning achievement, I think, which pushed Erdogan over the edge in trying to centralize power and essentially try and stave off the front of being taken down politically, which was the Gezi protests of 2013. At no other time in his presidency or his prime ministership has he had to mediate with popular opposition to this extent. The culmination of which, if you take the popular protests, the judicial onslaught against himself and his party, and not least of all, the corruption allegations, which I have frequently commented on as basically stating that makes the Watergate scandal look like child's play. But all of the culmination of this has really served to push Erdogan over the edge. And the crowning achievement, I think, of really pushing forward for the presidential system was with the coup attempt of July last year, which saw possibly a military challenge to actually forcibly removing a democratically elected leader. So there are a lot more things that can be said, but I think the background for this is, from my perspective, existentialism and survivability, and there are what if questions. What are the future prospects? I think Ozge has touched upon them very, very well. I think I would like to leave that up to try and answer more specific questions if you have it, but I'll yield my time or probably step over it. Thank you.
What I want to try and do is drill down on one particular issue that is actually quite related to the constitutional referendum, but also gives us a particular kind of empirical window into the rollbacks of democracy in Turkey. And in that, I want to look at the Kurdish issue. The Kurdish issue, the Kurdish question, the Kurdish problem, we hear a lot of different names for this in Turkey, is one of the sort of issues or problems that has been plaguing Turkey for a very long time. There's been a war between the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, and the Turkish government officially since 1984, but there have been Kurdish rebellions within Turkey since the founding of the republic in 1923. And so to understand the Kurdish issue and what it has to do with the constitutional referendum, we kind of have to go all the way back to 1923, and I'm going to do this really quickly, I promise. So when the modern Turkish Republic is founded in 1923 by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk and his followers, there is a sense that there are some dynamics that led to sort of the breakup, the dissolution, the falling apart of the Ottoman Empire. One of those is the over-reliance on Islam, hence the secularizing reforms that we see under the Turkish Republic. And the other is the danger, the inherent danger of ethnic nationalism. The idea that by associating along ethnic lines, we sort of create fractures or fissures along which our society can be ripped or rended apart. And this, is coming from from Atatürk and his group's own military experience during the Balkan Wars, during the First World War. There's, Macedonian, Serbian, Montenegrin, Albanian, Greek, all kinds of nationalisms that are seen as inherently dangerous, not just different in terms of identity, but dangerous. And so there's an effort under the Republican regime to eradicate the political identification with ethnicity. So any sort of admittance that you are a Kurd, naming your child a Kurdish name, using the Kurdish language is outlawed. It's seen as dangerous. It's seen as something that could, again, rip this attempted homogenous society apart. In nation-building projects, we always see efforts to homogenize, and this is something that we saw with the Kurds in Turkey. Kurds make up somewhere between around 15 million, perhaps even 20 million people in Turkey. So this is not a small number of people that we're dealing with. They're also spread across Syria, Iran, and Iraq, and you have some sort of cross-border relations there. But within Turkey, there was clearly an element of needing to eradicate Kurdish identity. We see numerous backlashes against this, and most prominently in the formation of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, a Marxist-Leninist party that fought against the state, that saw this as unjust, that was sick of its children being told, you're just mountain Turks, you've forgotten that you are, don't call yourself Kurd. So there was really a push to try to make a space for Kurdish identity. And the conflict that has been generated out of this since the initiation of war with the Turkish government in 1984 has taken somewhere between, at this point, around 50,000 lives, both military and civilian lives. Why is this relevant for what's going on with the constitutional referendum? Why am I giving a history lesson? So we saw an unprecedented attempt under the current AKP, the ruling Justice and Development Party, to try to address the Kurdish issue once and for all, to try to solve this problem that has been plaguing Turkey as one of the main national security issues. The AKP, I argue in my own work, is particularly well placed to do this. Previous governments, I argue, operate with what I call a Republican nationalist identity. This is, you may hear Kemalism, secularism, Western, but within those identity understandings is also an understanding of a Turkish identity that does not allow the expression of anything ethnic such as Kurdish identity. Those are previous governments. Those are governments that the military has supported, that have been in power up until the AKP. The AKP's understanding of identity, from my perspective, is something I call Ottoman Islamism. This is a sort of understanding of Turkish identity that is rooted in the legitimacy of the Ottoman Empire as the home of the Sultanate, the Caliphate. Turkey has sort of regional world legitimacy because of this. And identity is based mainly on religion rather than ethnicity. So for the AKP, the expression of ethnic politics is relatively okay. It's not something that's necessarily perceived of as dangerous. So under the AKP, you see numerous attempts to try to solve the Kurdish issue. And I do think that Recep Tayyip Erdogan would love to be able to take credit as the man that finally solves the Kurdish issue in Turkey. I think he would get a lot of personal prestige out of that. There were a couple of faltered openings. The 2009 opening, it kind of perceived by Kurds as superficial language. You're not really undertaking any significant reforms that are going to help us. You're just saying you're going to. What happens in 2013 is fundamentally different. In 2013, the AKP government opens secret negotiations with the PKK for the first time. And there is what is called a solution process, a çözüm süreci, which is essentially peace negotiations between the government and the PKK to try to solve this issue once and for all. And in fact, the PKK declares a ceasefire. The government says that it will recognize, it will allow mother tongue education in Kurdish. That doesn't actually ever happen, but they promise it. There are some changes that are made. But there's a sense that this is something new and exciting. And finally, this problem that has plagued Turkish society for so long is going to be solved. So what happens? What fundamentally goes so horribly wrong that we now see tensions between Kurds and Turks, between the PKK and the Turkish government right now, worse than we've ever seen, I would argue. More polarized than ever. It has to do with the constitutional referendum and the presidential project, which is why I'm taking you through this whole lesson. So, as part of this çözüm süreci, or this solution process, the PKK and Kurds in general are willing to support the government's efforts to push forward a presidential system. They sort of pledge their electoral support. They say, okay, well, we will support this system if you give us some concessions in return, like mother tongue language education, and so forth. This it is really, again, boding quite well. But what we see is, in 2014, with the siege of Kobani, Syrian border town, by ISIS, a fundamental recognition on the part of Kurds that the AKP government does not have their back. So why should they have its? The Kurds in Turkey, who share an immense amount of ethnic sympathy, as well as from the military, or from the militant standpoint, a lot of negotiation and close relations as well. But there's a sense that the Turkish government was refusing to protect the civilians of Kobani. They just wouldn't do it. They wouldn't reach out and do it. So a lot of things happened, but it can kind of be summed up as the Kurds revoking their support for the presidential project. Demirtaş, the leader of the People's Democratic Party, which is the pro-Kurdish liberal democratic party that Ozge mentioned, says, we're not going to make you president. This isn't going to happen. We're not behind you anymore. And Erdogan, very soon after that, says, well, I didn't recognize this process in the first place. This wasn't something that was going to be a legitimate negotiation process anyway. So he kind of he washes his hands of the process. On June 7th, 2015, as Ozge mentioned, the Kurds win over 10% of the electorate, which means that they would enter parliament as a party for the very first time. This is huge. Turkey has the highest electoral threshold to enter parliament of any country in the world. It's 10%. Put in place, by the way, so that Kurds don't get into parliament. So they're able to manage this. This is something for Erdogan that is fundamentally unacceptable. By doing this, by getting into parliament, the People's Democratic Party was also taking away the parliamentary majority that the AKP saw as legitimately theirs since 2002. So the first time you're taking away this parliamentary majority, and you're getting Kurds into parliament, and you've told me that you're not going to support my presidential system? No, that's not going to turn out well. Unfortunately, through a series of kind of back and forth attacks, the conflict resumes with the PKK again. It's disputed as to who actually starts it again, but we know that in middle of July, around July 23rd, 2015, that the Turkish government begins bombing the PKK again. Coincidentally, on the same day that it begins bombing ISIS. So while the international community is praising Turkey for finally joining the war with ISIS, Turkey is resuming its war with the PKK without a whole lot of international attention to it. It's quite clever, in fact. Now we see, again, these incredibly heightened tensions. Sieges of Kurdish villages, numerous civilian deaths because people are either getting caught in the crossfire, they can't leave their homes. Because of curfews, there's water shortages, medicine shortages, all kinds of things. And in a lot of ways because the Kurds refused to support Erdogan's presidential project. And for me, that is a true opportunity missed. And I think it's a way of thinking about the problems that Turkish democracy is going to have while also being able to link one of those problems directly with the constitutional referendum. Thank you.
So thank you very much. I just learned a lot in a half an hour, and maybe we could all thank all three panelists one more time. So by the good luck of being on the faculty at Columbia, I had an opportunity to learn that when it comes to discussions of Turkish politics, I should stand aside and listen. And so I want to very quickly get to the questions from the audience because I know there will be some interesting questions and comments from all of you, but I am going to violate what I've learned and ask the first question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. And I wanted to come back to the actual institutions that were just passed on Sunday. And if you read the cursory description of these in the New York Times, they're kind of apocalyptically concentrating power in the hands of a single person. And if you read Al Jazeera, they're sort of vanilla institutional changes that might be kind of comfortable in many places in the West. And in fact, if you think about one of the leading philosophies in political science about how do we think about democracy, it's the accountability perspective that Joseph Schumpeter put forward very clearly, which is that the role of democracy is to be able to throw the rascals out. And so the best kind of democracy is one where you concentrate as much power in the hands of an identifiable incumbent. You have an opposition, and the voters can keep or toss, and that makes the incumbent do what the voters want. Then there's many ways in which you could defend the current set of institutions as trying to create that possibility. But at the same time, for that to work, first of all, there have to be certain kinds of freedoms to become candidates and to learn about what the government did, and so you need not to throw journalists in jail. But you also needed an identifiable opposition, and so one way to think about the institutions is that they're really not all that bad per se if you think about them in the abstract. If you would put them in Sweden, maybe they would work, but they might be bad given the particular context that we find ourselves in Turkey. Ozge in some ways made a rather ironic statement, which is one of the problems with the institutions is that the opposition is fractionalized. So Erdogan's institutions don't work because the opposition is incompetent, which is sort of hard to blame Erdogan for in some ways. And so we hear that we have a very unusual history of Erdogan and his existential threat that's always survived, and that might be part of the context. We have a fractionalized set of identities and a very big problem with the Kurds. And so I just wondered if any of you would like to reflect on, are these institutions really bad, or are these institutions bad in Turkey because?
Can I make a quick comment on the incompetence of the opposition, because I think that's mentioned a lot, but I mean, the referendum I think clearly showed that the opposition is not incompetent, but given the discussion about the Kurdish conflict, there are very severe cleavages in Turkey, which makes it very difficult for the opposition to come together. So the Kurdish nationalists and the Turkish nationalists, they find it very hard to come together. It's not, I think, incompetency, but the society, so polarized society has historically been so, the cleavage has been so deep that it's really hard. So I just wanted to...
I love Schumpeter references. One of the few things in political theory I very much enjoyed going through, but it's very nuanced and I think very relevant when you sort of think of systemic changes such as this in any context, but in this case it's Turkey, and that yes, its democratic form of government is based on the notion of yes, voters coming to the polls once every whatever number of years is predicated, and have the ability to throw the rascals out, that the outcome of elections is not predetermined. Right? It's some 101 lessons that we talk about in any setting, whether it's the New York Times or our classrooms. But one of the alarming, not necessarily institution that's now built into the new constitutional arrangement, but just in terms of practice, what we have seen clearly in this referendum and possibly the previous national election in November 2015, is we now have both the process and the procedures in place in Turkey whereby the outcome of elections is predetermined. And that is a scary thought, I think. And I can elaborate on this, we can all elaborate on this, I think, thereby it was never the intention of Tayyip Erdogan to ensure an unknown outcome. And there are mechanisms, individuals, and procedures in place right now whereby subsequent elections might just be acclamatory. The process of free and fair elections, we've had issues with them being fair, media access, political opposition survivability, lack of government intimidation in the public sphere, etc. That's one thing. Right now, I am absolutely certain that there is no procedure or process whereby the outcome of elections is not determined in advance.
Thank you. I think first it's, I think both Sinan and Ozge touched on this a bit, but I think it's important to recognize that what we see with the passage of the referendum is essentially a de jure institutionalization of a de facto system that has been in place, incrementally put in place over the last few years. With constitutional referendum packages, we should also remember that the current constitution, the one in place, is the 1982 military-written constitution that has been in dire need of reform for a long time. So in that sense, there's agreement on the fact that it needs to change. There's a lot of disagreement on how it needs to change and who should be responsible for doing so. But we've seen constitutional reform packages, particularly in 2010. And then, of course, with the state of emergency that was declared following the coup attempt, Erdogan can already sort of rule by decree, has been declaring, making emergency decrees on laser hair removal, all kinds of amazing issues. Get support from every corner you can. So I think that we should recognize that it has been an incremental process. So it's not necessarily that we're going to see something change overnight by any means. But I really like the question of, are these institutions is it inherently bad institutional design, or does it depend on who is in place, who's running it? And one of the things that, John, you mentioned over lunch that I thought was quite an important irony is we often think of removing the role of military in politics as being inherently moving towards democracy. And for Turkey, and a lot of the things that I write about is the use of EU foreign policy, of EU accession criteria to remove this domestic obstacle, the military that has so many times been involved in threatening or shutting down or removing from power the parties in the political Islam tradition that Sinan mentioned. So these reforms have incrementally removed the role of the military in politics, and we, as scholars of democracy, should applaud that. But you're also removing a check, a balance on a party that has seen that check or that balance as an enemy for a long time. So I think that's something that's quite important. Does it matter sort of who's in power and how are the rules followed? Since I have one of my foreign policy decision-making students in the class, I'm going to reference one of our studies, which is the theory of individuals as constraint respecters or constraint challengers. Even if there's not an official system in place that says, or there's not an official check or balance that says you shouldn't just issue emergency decree after emergency decree or rule by decree, does one feel constrained by norms and not wanting to necessarily overstep a position of power? Or does one see any kind of check and balance as an inherent obstacle that needs to be overcome and is illegitimate? And I think I would put Recep Tayyip Erdogan squarely in the constraint challenging box.
Thank you very much. So let's open it up for questions. Do we need to pass a microphone for the technology to work? I have two requests as we take questions, and one is that you just tell us a sentence about yourself, and the other is that you respect that there's a lot of people who have questions, so that we try to keep things appropriately brief. Thank you.
Can I start really briefly on that one? So we were sort of talking about the brain drain earlier, but I just wanted to relate this to the Kurdish issue really quickly. One of the sorts of targets of mainly post-coup attempt purges were those who'd signed the Academics for Peace petition, which was started in Turkey, but then it also involved hundreds of thousands of, or I should say not hundreds of thousands, but thousands, of academics around the world protesting the Turkish government's military campaign in the Kurdish region. And those who have signed it, many of those who signed it have found themselves fired from their positions. I was on a panel at Cornell about a month ago with a scholar who was lucky to be taken in with the Scholar at Risk program. There's the Scholar Rescue Fund. So if maybe you're thinking sort of, what can we do about things like this, you can contribute to funds like that. But this campaign of purges has many, many effects. And I also know those who are still working in Turkish universities wondering every day, are they going to open up their email and see, you have been taken from your job and that's it, right? Like there's no explanation, there's no recourse, there's nothing. But then there's the others who are having to pick up all the courses that those people were teaching. And so there's a huge dysfunction. And if you think about that in the context of the military too, I think is really fascinating. So I just wanted to add that dimension. If you guys maybe want to take on the brain drain question, or
about the brain drain, I don't want to say anything. I'm like working as an academic in Turkey. Of course, I feel the pressure. I mean, in terms of the future, what will happen to these people, I don't know. I mean, of course, we are all worried about it. We're all trying to put, some pressure from civil society on the government to change these sorts of events. But in terms of what will happen, I can't really say anything. But in terms of your point about the economy, I think there's maybe something else to say, because there was also a violation of the property rights in Turkey too, so which is of course a very critical issue for further investment. So I mean, that will be a problem, I think, in Turkey too.
I'll just add that, what you have right now is Turkey's been held together essentially by, quote unquote, the charismatic leadership of one man. And the system has been adjusted politically for now, which has brought him a bit of time, we don't know how long, to insulate and isolate him from further political pressures such as popular protests or judicial challenges or curtailments of individual and executive power. Fine. What you allude to is just one of the factors, whether it's academic freedoms or the economy, and how. I will stake a lot in predicting that this cannot continue. Just from the perspective of political science, I know nothing about economy except what I learned in macroeconomics, which was better than my microeconomics, I should say. Both my colleague Lisel, especially Lisel, sort of, look into Kurds, but also if you look at Ozge's sort of trends that she's put up there in terms of electoral, all of these are representative of a highly diversified or cleavage-based society. We don't have a left and right in Turkey. We really haven't had it for a long time. There are so many dividing lines in Turkey, fault lines in Turkey, I should say, that one person rule that is surrounded by 7 or 8 advisors who are not experts in anything except loyalty. I do not know how you engender political economic solutions. 2 examples, and I'll be quiet. On the night of the referendum, as the results were being counted, the exchange rate ticked up by 0.4 Turkish cents. And when asked why that was the case, it was determined that basically one investor had bought $50 million. Because someone purchased $50 million in an economy the size of Turkey's and it ticked up 4 Turkish cents, I was shocked. The other example is, up until now, Erdogan relied on 40%, thereabouts, of the electoral sort of map or landscape to ensure continued stability and rule. Now he's upped the ante. He needs 50% from here on in to actually do this. I don't know where those votes are going to come from if we do have a system whereby supposedly the outcome is not determined, but I don't have much faith in that.
I'll take on the EU accession talks. I've often been asked, could the referendum make relations between Turkey and the EU any worse? And no, I don't think relations could get any worse between Turkey and the EU, particularly following the Dutch or the tulip crisis, whereby there were this sort of tussle between the Netherlands and Turkey over whether or not Turkish ministers could campaign within Turkey. And the Dutch said no, and then that led Erdogan and his foreign minister to call Europeans fascists and Nazis and racists. So that doesn't bode very well. We've been seeing the AKP make claims such as, well, we don't need the EU, we can join the Shanghai Five. We've got lots of other options for a long time. My take on the EU accession process is, as I sort of alluded to earlier, very much a strategic one, which was meant to reduce domestic competition for the AKP rather than any sort of genuine long-term bid to actually join the EU. So I see that process as over for this party, although they've been paying lip service to it for some time. What I think is really dangerous from that perspective is the issue of the refugee crisis, because the EU Turkey has a lot of leverage over the EU. It keeps threatening to open its borders and send refugees to Turkey by the busload, to the EU by the busload if the EU doesn't pay up the 6 billion euros that it promised. So I don't see, for example, that EU countries have a whole lot of leverage or normative pressure that they can apply on Turkey because they're sort of hamstrung by this refugee issue.
Great question.
Yeah.
And great answer.
Also great co-author of a monkey cage piece on the Turkish referendum, Melina Dunham. Yes, thank you.
So Turkish foreign policy traditionally was hammered out and put together prior to Erdogan and with Erdogan for a bit on two essential institutional compositions, which was the weighing in of the military national security establishment of Turkey, as well as the sort of what they referred subsequently as the Monşer foreign policy diplomatic corps, the elites within the front. And they were quite capable actually in determining Turkey's foreign policy credentials. And Erdogan relied on this for the first term or two terms of his office, essentially. But when he came to office, you were looking at a leader, and this is not just for facetious reasons, it's just a fact, that had no foreign policy experience, had rarely been out of the country, if at all, in 2003. And notions like the European Union, pushing ahead with Cyprus, building closer transatlantic ties, and basically being pragmatically engaged in these processes was something that he followed for practical purposes, but also for purposes that legitimized his rule at home with vis-a-vis his opponents, but also resulted in Turkey's profile being risen in the world. Right now, the EU perspective has been transactionalized to the point of having just come out of this with a 51% vote in the referendum, which most sane people I think see as illegitimate, based on for a variety of reasons. He needs to build some sort of real popularity. He needs some sort of base to you need an enemy. And the EU serves this up very well. Right now, there's going to be deliberations. Already less than 24 hours before the referendum vote was over, he stated that he may ask Turkish citizens to vote on the future of the EU accession process, as well as bringing back the death penalty, which would almost certainly kill the EU accession process. And I'll end on this note, which I think is the slightly more worrying thing for me. Up until this point, I just thought there would be a lot of push and pull, a tug of war between Erdogan and the EU, and it's like whatever. Up until now as in post-2013 Gezi protests, every country, whether it's the United States or specifically the United States, has a grand narrative, a grand strategy, an anchor of where it positions itself in the world. Here we talk about our values, our democratic governance structures, international diplomacy, the international liberal order, etc., etc. Turkey's narrative is essentially the European anchor, the Western anchor, security-wise, values-wise, for better or worse, right or wrong. Successive governments have used that and leveraged that to building Turkey's international standing, and it basically builds the platform from which you devise national and international policies. Right now, we have no narrative. Turkey has essentially a tit for tat with the EU, unless you accept the results of this referendum as I dictate it to you, then we might be out of it. And the same with the United States, unless you stop cooperating with terrorists, then we might not. What then? Turkey has no standing in the international community right now, and that's worrying. Okay, thank you for the question. Yes, that's another, UK is another home for me, and seeing that tumble out of the Eurozone and the EU in general is also very sad. What you're looking at, specific institution that can basically be cited at this point is the High Election Council, right? Now, this is all unconfirmed, unsubstantiated. There's no smoking gun evidence. All there is journalistic accounts, people in the field, pollsters, and some confidential testimonies that have been put out there by certain state officials as to how the outcome was basically manipulated so that a yes vote in the referendum for Erdogan's proposals came out. Essentially what you're looking at is manipulation of electoral data by the election authorities on the night of the referendum, whereby as the raw data is being fed into the actual system, manipulation of that data is inflating the yes votes so that people on TV screens, when they look at it, are getting a result which is not necessarily reflective of the truth. Time is essentially necessary to actually build the connections, the dots in how that specifically occurred. You're also looking at the High Election Council itself acting illegally. That we do know. So for a ballot paper in the referendum or any election to be valid, it needs two things. The ballot paper's back has to have an official stamp, and the envelope in which the ballot is placed in and sealed also has to have an official stamp. That's law. That's not discretion. That's not, well, we'll ignore that for now, or it's okay. What happened during the referendum, about an hour into the counting, there were reports by ballot box monitors saying that ballots were being counted which did not carry the official stamps. So it could have been put into the ballot. That's the presumption, that these are stuffed ballot boxes. Within an hour of that, the High Election Council head, Chief Percy, actually goes on and releases a statement and says, until these votes can be proved as illegitimate, they will be accepted. That is illegal. The reason why this has happened, because it's power politics, it's a fait accompli. Who is going to change that? Who is going to stop that? Who is going to challenge that? All this is in the courts now, but it's essentially done and dusted for now.
Courts which are now mostly stacked by the AKP. So.
And yeah, I just want to say that the independence of most of the institutions are already questioned. So given the context, one of the worrying signs was that especially this decision was taken after pressure from the government is mostly worrying. I mean, it's too early to say whether the decision made an impact on the results, because we don't know what the extent was, were these invalid votes that were counted as well. So it's too early to say the impact of it. But, the institution could not stand up to the government is, I think, pretty much clear. So again, it says something about the independence of a really crucial institution that will have an impact on the election. I can maybe say that the European conflict, the tulip or Dutch conflict, it was such a used in a populist manner. If you look at, for example, the polls results that I showed you in the beginning, you see that there's an immediate increase afterwards. So it was a tool that to increase in a populist manner the votes very clearly. And the foreign policy was so inconsistent, we cannot really know how it will change in the future. So again, it can be used in this populist manner. Whether there will be more consistency because maybe the government feels more secure now, I can't really say.
I mean, sorry, just really quickly, I do think in that sense that the EU has played into the hands of Erdogan in kind of an ironic sense. And I think that that's kind of what you're getting at, so that's a really intuitive, fantastic question. So you mentioned Ukraine and Georgia. I would also note, Turks also point to Croatia, for example. I mean, Turks, so yes, the EU accession process has had many different official steps, but Turks have been institutionally affiliated with the EU for almost 50 years? I mean, they've had many, many different forms of agreements with them. So this as much as Turkey's attempts at reform slowed down and therefore didn't meet the EU Copenhagen criteria, the accession criteria, the EU was also not forthcoming or welcoming. I mean, Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy's comments do nothing, for the EU cause within Turkey. And in fact, they do quite a lot for the populist narrative of the AKP. So this whole tulip crisis just couldn't have come at a better time. I mean, it's just like a gift. And it was, it was funny. It was a bit of a gift for the Dutch government as well, because the Dutch Prime Minister is running against Geert Wilders, who is, an Islamophobe, and so they're able to look strong against, an AKP at the same time that the AKP can say, hey, the EU hates us anyway, so wasn't I right all along? Sure, just really briefly, it's a fascinating question, and the Turkey-Tunisia comparison to me is amazing, because it used to be that Turkey was the model of democracy in the region and Tunisia was one of the most authoritarian regimes under Ben Ali, and now you have Tunisia perhaps being a model for doing better with political Islam than Turkey has. So it's a little interesting reversal of fortunes there. One of the questions that I think is important to address is that I don't see Turkey moving towards a theocracy, for example. I don't see Sharia law being instituted. I don't see, the government wanting to rule along Islamist lines. The AKP was actually pointed to by Vali Nasser, for example, as one of these Muslim democratic parties. And I think that they've kind of shown their colors, that they're not as moderate as, or accepting of or as tolerant of other views as he would have said. For me, Islam has been used as a populist mobilization tool by the party. It does inform to a certain extent how the government would like to see society organized. It would like to increase the role of Islam in the public sphere. It would like to have Imam Hatip schools opened. It would like to have more religiously educated individuals in the government, indicated by the fact that Imam Hatip schools, which are preacher training schools, are open to girls as well as boys. So it's having a religious education and then kind of moving through the channels of civil society and government. So there's definitely a move to increase that. And there was for a long time this sort of role of Turkey as a Muslim brother in the region, not just supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, but wanting to kind of be the Sunni, as you point out. There's a huge Alevi-Sunni divide in Turkey, and the AKP is not very Alevi-friendly, shall we say. So there was definitely a foreign policy role in terms of, again, reviving this Ottoman legitimacy, as well, being the savior of the Palestinian cause and so forth. I don't see this moving towards a theocratic regime in any sense. I think it's much more authoritarianism using Islam as a popular mobilization device.
It's a wonderful question that we all try to understand. I want to mention one thing that we discussed prior to the panel during lunch. Since 2002, one of the amazing things was that there were these shifting coalitions. So I think that also keeps the 40% fresh, because that 40% is not exactly the same 40%. So there was, for example, in the beginning a coalition with the liberals who were, for example, against the intervention of the military in the Turkish politics. So they were willing to form a coalition. At some point there was a coalition with the Kurdish population, and the current coalition seems to be the nationalist coalition. So whether this is going to continue or not, whether that can shift again, is very. It is quite possible. There can be another rapprochement with the Kurdish population. I think it is quite possible, and then there might be another shifting coalition that will keep the government in place. Another, I don't know, that 40% stay there for maybe 4 or 5 more years. So I think that was one of the crucial factors that affected to this lasting coalition. But again, why does, one of the puzzling things for me is, why do the voters accept these inconsistencies? When you see these shifting coalitions, you should be skeptical about the government, right, or the party, because, I think you would want to keep a consistent policy in power, a consistent group of, a consistent group in power, but the voters still see these consistencies. I think they are aware of it. Maybe this is affected, distorted by the media, but a lot of people are aware of these, but they are still willing to accept it. That is the puzzle that I really find it hard to understand. But,
Can I take the foreign policy aspect really quickly? So the Turkish flip-flop on Israel has been really fascinating. And Turkey, and this actually gets to Ozge's point about inconsistencies. There's inconsistencies in terms of domestic coalition partners, and there's also inconsistencies in foreign policy. And with Israel, Turkey was the first Muslim country to recognize Israel, but under the AKP, and particularly as it consolidated its rule and wanted more sort of support from using this Islam as a political mobilization tool and being the savior of the Palestinians, you saw a lot of populist rhetoric that had an anti-Semitic tone to it. You saw, Erdogan's famous one-minute speech at the Davos World Economic Forum, where he stands up against Shimon Peres and says, "You know well how to kill," and walks off stage and says, "Turkey's done with the World Economic Forum forever," which gives him a huge amount of political support back home, and he comes home to crowds waving. So I think he's used Israel very much as a tool of consolidating domestic political support. The Mavi Marmara incident is another. It was an NGO-sponsored flotilla that was trying to break the Gaza Brigade, but we know that it was supported by the government, and the government got a lot of political capital for it. And eventually, relations break down to the point where you don't have formal diplomatic relations. Turkey, I think, kind of finding itself, as Sinan pointed out, with no anchor, no foreign policy friends whatsoever. And having alienated even Russia with the downing of the Turkish jet and losing a lot of economic gains from that, tourism and sanctions and all kinds of stuff, realized it had to carry out a rapprochement with Israel. And it did so with Israel and Russia on the same day, which I thought was quite fascinating, and then sold it back home as having won the fight, having gained an apology for the attacks on Turkish Mavi Marmara supporters from Netanyahu and so forth. So they really spun that as a victory, but I think it was a recognition of the need for economic cooperation with Israel. But I think it is important, as you point out, there have been anti-Semitic undertones to Erdogan himself and to his party members. I mean, I think we've already talked about that to a certain extent, the role that populism, or the role that the EU can play in a populist narrative. I think you're absolutely right that the AKP has been able to spin the EU's rejection of Turkey in a very efficient and electorally successful way. And I do think that both the EU and Turkey are equally to blame in this relationship. I think the EU has never really had a true, genuine, sincere commitment to Turkey. I think that Germany was kind of backed into it by the presence of Gastarbeiter, by the presence of the guest workers in Turkey. The Turkish guest workers in Germany. So I don't think that there was ever 100% belief that Turkey would be able to carry out the reforms. I think many people never saw a resolution to the Cyprus issue. We came extremely close, but it was actually on the Greek Cypriot side that you saw a nationalist elected, and that sort of scuppered that. So I have a class I have to teach at 2:40, so I'm going to say very briefly that I think it was on the part of both that sort of this marriage went wrong. And in fact, I interviewed an AKP official that said, yeah, it's kind of like a marriage that went wrong. So I'll leave it at that.
Can I just add one thing very quickly? And this is one of the things that I talk about with Turkey and EU. At the end of the day, I mean, yes, I think ultimately there's an equal blame to go around to a lesser or greater extent on both sides. But I always say this when I speak to my Turkish friends or Turks in general. Accession to the EU, whilst it's based on rules, at the final juncture is a political outcome. That is, every single member state, without offering any reason, one way or another, has to say yes. By definition, accession to the EU is political. And I think this is one of the things that we fundamentally lacked as an understanding as Turks. But obviously it has been manipulated by European governments for a variety of reasons, also by the institutions. But whatever we do at the end, we have to resign ourselves, or Turks have to resign themselves to the notion that, okay, if we fill the accession criteria, all chapters have been closed successfully. One member country out of 20 whatever now can say, well, I'm not feeling like it. So it's an undetermined outcome.
Okay, we have people who have to rush to class, and before we do, I just wanted to say thank you again to the Executive Vice President of All Things Global, and to the Institute for the Study of Europe, who helped organize this, to the new Sabanci Center, to the audience for making a really robust question and answer period, and especially here to our panelists who really did a nice job. Thank you.